Right, I've been scribbling notes all day to find out when people say Todd will be talking about this later, so I hope I'll be able to fit in most of that. And also everyone was saying, I've got 2 millennia, I've got 3 millennia, I've got 9 millennia. I'll try not to use it as an excuse for talking too fast, but I will read it so I don't digress too much, so if you'll put up with me. I want to give you an overview of a project that I've been co-directing since 2005 on behalf of the British School in Athens with colleagues from the HERAKLEION Ephoria of the Greek Hellenic Archaeological Service. As you've already heard today, Knossos was one of the most important centres on Crete and in the southern Aegean for nearly 8 millennia. Now, I've got there, whatever. For most of our picture, so clearly illustrated in the earlier talks today, our picture is built on the major research excavations conducted by Sir Arthur Evans and other archaeologists from the British School in Athens. These have largely clustered around the prehistoric palace cleared by Evans, but have also explored some of the outlying cemeteries. However, surrounding the palace, and largely invisible today, are some 1.5 square kilometres of ancient city. This has been more broadly tested through rescue excavations, initially those conducted by Evans, then by members of the British School. For the past 30 years, these have been undertaken by the Greek Archaeological Service. Always under pressure, rescue excavations are usually small, rushed, frustrating, and rarely produce material or context judged to justify full publication. But in aggregate, these provide considerably broader coverage, in many cases our only window on major expanses of the site, particularly as one moves away from the area of the Bronze Age palace. Together, over a century of continuous and intensive research by both organizations has made Knossos one of the most thoroughly investigated sites in the Eastern Mediterranean. Drawing on these excavations, building particularly on the compilations made by Sinclair Hood, it's possible to sketch the long-term development of the site, shown schematically on the right. 2 things are worth noting here. First, that many of the dots simply indicate that sherds of a given date were noted at a specific point in the landscape, and they tell us nothing else. And second, that the dots drop off rapidly as one moves away from the center of the site, so these reconstructions, which I have to admit I did, are highly speculative. By 2000, 100 years after the start of Evans's excavations, it was clear that an intensive surface survey of the site was necessary. Comprehensive documentation of the whole site was also becoming increasingly urgent to ensure its preservation. It lies some 6 kilometers south of Heraklion, which for the last 3 decades has been one of the most rapidly expanding cities in Greece. In the mid-1970s, a restricted development zone was defined around the site to limit construction and to protect the archaeological remains. An index of the success of this protection can be seen here, where the maps plot buildings in this expanding suburb of Heraklion at 3 points over the past 50 years. But there's now very intense pressure for development in the area, and detailed documentation of the archaeological remains is essential to inform the Archaeological Service's management strategies. We defined 3 broad objectives for the project: to record the archaeological resources, to aid their protection, and to help manage the development in the valley. Second, to document systematically the record, allowing us to contextualize and reassess a century of previous investigations. And third, to integrate the new surface data with all that existing information to reconstruct the long-term urban dynamics of the community at Knossos. We started our fieldwork in 2005 on the city site and moved outwards in later years. We spent 2006 doing preliminary documentation of over 300,000 artifacts, which we collected in 2005, resuming survey again in 2007, continuing in 2008. We've now completed the first overview of all recovered material and started specialist studies of it. Over 3 6-week field seasons, we surveyed all available fields in the study area on a 20-meter grid, providing dense and high-resolution coverage. Collectors picked up all surface material in a 10-square-meter area to provide a very tightly controlled standard sample. Outside the city, to ensure that we would cover the entire study area, we searched faster transects, schematized on the lower there. Overall, we collected some 355,000 sherds, about 50,000 fragments of tile, which Ken showed you earlier and I won't show you again, and another 20,000 non-ceramic artifacts distributed in some 21,000 collection units, spread over 11 square kilometers, encompassing the cemeteries of all dates which surround the city on all sides. We also encountered plenty of features, such as walls, tombs, and stray architectural blocks. This slide also gives an idea of the range of other finds. Unfortunately, these really are the best we've got, so I'm very glad you've already seen some nice things from the site earlier in other people's lectures. Now, I'm regularly asked, often by archaeologists who primarily excavate, what collecting all this rubbish from the surface can actually tell us. Actually quite a lot, even if on a much lower spatial, temporal, and behavioral resolution than you would get from in-situ material from an excavation. The reason can be seen in this plan and section from the unexplored mansion excavation at Knossos. Later occupants often dug pits as bedding trenches for walls or to bury rubbish, bringing earlier material to the surface. And that's what I've indicated in blue on the right, the pits above the Minoan unexplored mansion. At Knossos, this is particularly acute, as later occupants dug down to the Minoan levels to salvage the dressed ashlar blocks for reuse. And as Adonis has previously remarked, this accounts for the limited preservation of deposits of early Iron Age to Hellenistic date. As a graphic example of the surface record, on the left I mapped surface finds of Roman tessera, the little stone cubes used to make the mosaics that Ken has just been showing us. Now, the really bad news is that if these are on the surface, they represent mosaics which have been partially or completely destroyed, largely in the planting during the 1960s and 70s of the olive trees, which now blanket most of the site today. And this view in the upper right is a picture taken from the hill of Elias to the east of the site in about 1964, 1965, when all those fields were still vineyards. And so that destruction has largely taken place over the last 40 years or so. On the lower right, you can see a damaged mosaic excavated by R.W. Hutchinson in 1938, and you can get an idea of just how close it is to the surface. So for most of the 1.5 square kilometers of the ancient city, the prehistoric levels are generally about 3 to 6 meters down, largely inaccessible beneath the later levels. The Greek levels have been largely quarried away by Hellenistic and Roman builders, and the Roman levels over much of the site have suffered recent and often fairly severe damage. So trying to make the most of this readily accessible surface record is something of a consolation prize. I simply had to resign myself to having to look in the excavation storage boxes to remind myself of what real artifacts look like. Now, as you can see on the right, which plots counts of sherds of all dates against the locations of previous investigations are in black, the survey provides us with much more extensive and continuous documentation of the archaeological record of the city. In fact, the picture provided by previous work is highly skewed toward the area around the palace, which has been the focus for most of the research excavations, and the areas of the two villages, the hospital, and the main road, where most of the rescue excavations have taken place. Those are what I've highlighted in green on the left. Looked at against what the survey now documents as the full distribution of material, well over half of the site has never seen any investigation at all, and we can now document a largely unsuspected halo of deposits representing suburbs, cemeteries, and other outlying activities around the city. Now, survey and excavation have often been presented as alternative strategies, and to the degree that we compete for the same funding, which unfortunately is the case, the debates about the relative merits of each can really get quite lively. But as I hope will be clear, the attraction of surveying at Knossos has been to see how effectively we can integrate both strategies as complementary sources of information. It is precisely because of the wealth of information generated by over a century of excavation, which you've seen glimpses of today, that we're able to push the boundaries of what's normally attempted with surface survey. Now, that's what we've been doing and why we're doing it. It's obviously early days yet, but what are we actually learning? So in my remaining time, I want to indicate ways in which our survey data complement, help contextualize, and flesh out the rich pictures already presented today that are largely built on evidence from numerous excavations. Starting at the beginning, Peter Tompkins has explained the development of the Neolithic community. From the survey, the only significant amounts of Neolithic material occur immediately north of the palace, indicating that the site extended slightly into this area, which has not been previously investigated. But perhaps more significant than what we found is what we didn't find. The sherds we recovered confirmed that fragile, low-fire Neolithic pottery can actually survive on the surface for considerable periods of time. And that means that the absence of any concentrations of such material elsewhere in the valley indicate that the occupation of that valley was highly nucleated on the original hill under the later palace. So it's giving us a wider context to appreciate just how distinctive that occupation is. Now, the Neolithic also highlights the useful complementarity of excavation and survey. Survey immediately around the palace was pointless, given the presence of Evans's excavation spoil dumps, and that much of the area nearby is covered by villages and by the two villages and the car parks. To fill this gap, so we could survey the areas that are shown there in yellow, we couldn't survey the areas in white. To help fill this gap, I looked through all of the retained material from the excavations around the fringe of the palace and rescue excavations further out. Peter was obviously already doing this for all of the soundings on the palace site itself, and we've very usefully swapped information over the last few years. As well as refining the dates for many excavated deposits, searching back through the unpublished boxes revealed several significant previously unrecognized deposits of Neolithic and pre-palatial material that had been overlooked in the past. Negative evidence is also relevant to excavations, and the green dots that I've put on here on the plot indicate soundings to natural soil which did not encounter significant deposits of Neolithic material, which allow us to tightly define the maximum extent of the Neolithic community along the ridge to the west, where there hasn't been all that much in the way of large-scale excavations. For the early pre-palatial period, early Minoan 1 and 2, we face the same constraints on coverage, but again, the absence of certain concentrations away from the Palace Hill confirms the picture provided by the excavations of a densely nucleated site underlying the later palace. Both positive and negative evidence indicate only a little expansion of occupation westwards to the modern road, indicated by the arrow, beyond the earlier Neolithic community. Now, I say only a little expansion. That being said, the site was still something on the order of 6.5 hectares in extent, and probably quite densely occupied. The population of the site may have exceeded 2,000 people by the later 3rd millennium, making it one of the largest communities in the early Bronze Age Aegean. Early Minoan 3 to Middle Minoan 1a, the late pre-palatial period, represents the lead-up to the emergence of the Minoan palace states. And as Peter and Colin have noted, this is documented by the massive northwest terrace wall underlying the later palace and other constructions that could be attributed to that same phase. Rescue excavations under the villages and the modern road usually reveal ceramics of this date as the earliest material on natural soil, thereby documenting dense, continuous occupation across the area and implying the very rapid expansion of the community during this relatively short late pre-palatial phase. The excavated deposits indicate occupation over some 20 hectares, but a few distant outlying excavations, such as Evans's in the north quarter of the city, or those by Hutchinson, Payton, and others, soundings under the Roman Villa Dionysus, raise the possibility that the settlement may have extended to as much as 40 hectares. The surface finds provide some support for this, including the expansion of occupation to the slope of the Gypsaves Hill immediately to the south of the palace, where very small quantities of contemporary sherds have also been recovered from most excavations in that area. So we may be talking about a site up to about 40 hectares in size. Considerably more material can be ascribed to the Middle Minoan periods, including Proto-Palatial and the earliest Neo-Palatial, the dark-faced Middle Minoan 3 wares, documented continuing dramatic, effectively exponential population expansion through these periods. This was the period in which Cretan polities established sustained contact with the Bronze Age states of the Eastern Mediterranean. While way out on the fringe of the known world, Knossos was as large and significant a center as most of the Levantine cities it interacted with. Expansion continued, though slowing, into the Neo-Palatial period, when occupation probably covered about a square kilometre, nearly doubling the estimates for the extent of the site, which were based on the excavated evidence alone. Judging by the residential densities in areas that have been excavated, both at Knossos and other sites, this should represent a population approaching 25,000 inhabitants. This is urbanism on a scale comparable to all but the largest capital cities of the Bronze Age East Mediterranean. For the Neo-Palatial period, the character of the houses excavated at various points moving out from the palace gives us some idea of the internal organization at the core of the city, and Peter Warren made allusion to that in the first paper this morning. Of course, this kind of information from the excavations provides a subtlety of understanding that surface evidence can only rarely provide. On the summit of the hill of Elias, to the east, we can now better define two small, distinct suburbs, recognized in the late 1970s by Sinclair Hood, highlighted on the left in blue. Further out, highlighted on the right in green, we seem to be picking up two distinct small sites out there away from the urban site itself. Based on limited tomb evidence, an analogy with the distribution of the later, better represented late Minoan 2 to 3 tombs, the city was ringed on the east, south, west, and potentially also the north by cemeteries. These clusters of tombs are well characterized by published examples like Mavrospilio, which Andrew will discuss later. We didn't expect to recover much evidence for cemeteries on the surface because the standard rock-cut tombs protect their contents from exposure. But we can now suggest various new outlying cemeteries defined by distinct low-density scatters of late Minoan material. Recovery is undoubtedly patchy, with some excavated cemeteries showing no surface signature whatsoever, but numerous areas never previously investigated seem likely candidates for new cemetery areas, all the way rigging the site. For the late Bronze Age, we have not for the later late Bronze Age, we have so far not attempted to subdivide our limited number of diagnostic sherds. We're talking about less than 500 sherds that I've been able to identify so far to late Minoan 2 to 3. This spans the period of the collapse of Minoan palatial society with the destruction and only partial reoccupation of the palace, as Colin was explaining earlier. Settlement evidence documenting how demography related to changing political status would provide a welcome new source of information on this transformation. Realistically speaking, however, we have so few examples of the most highly diagnostic fine painted wares that even with expert assessment, the samples will probably be too small for very confident phase-by-phase mapping of the city. Here, useful work could be done re-examining the relevant material from the scattered small rescue excavations from the site, as I've attempted to do for the pre-palatial material. Viewed over the long term, we can now document very rapid urbanization in the late pre-palatial period, with continuing dramatic expansion through the proto-palatial and neo-palatial periods. This gives a dynamic and novel perspective on both the origin and continuing development of a Minoan state. In addition, Knossos in the late neo-palatial period was twice the size of any other palatial center, providing new support for the argument that it politically dominated at least central Crete. We can tie such political inferences at least partially to our survey evidence by considering the territory which would have been required simply to feed the population that we can estimate for the city in different phases. This gives only a minimum definition of its dependent territory, but it does provide a new basis for constructing political inferences about the importance of Knossos across that region. The Hellenic phase, running from sub-Minoan through Hellenistic, covers a millennia, a little longer than the Palatial Bronze Age. We have not yet, in our initial assessments, attempted to subdivide most of this abundant material. However, based on some very distinctive shapes and decoration, we have identified significant quantities of protogeometric through orientalizing sherds plotted here. As Adonis has already mentioned, this allows us to decisively support one of the two models for early polis development at Knossos, and indeed potentially at other sites too. Our evidence takes two forms, together I think conclusive. The surface evidence for the site dramatically adds to the exiguous excavated settlement evidence, indicating a site expanding to at least half a square kilometer by the early Archaic period. Contextualizing this, there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest small hamlets adjacent to the known dispersed early Iron Age cemeteries, which were essentially the other alternative model. The data we now have documenting a very substantial community is more consistent with the evidence from the extensive tomb excavations presented by Adonis for a wealthy and interregionally very well-connected community. Now, despite the dearth of well-preserved excavated deposits, further work with the surface ceramics should allow us to track the development of the city continuously across this millennium, as Knossos expanded its regional political status through conquest and alliances. This is particularly important since, as Adonis mentioned, Crete preserves a relatively scanty historical record for this very dynamic period. One interim conclusion we can draw, however, is that Knossos probably reached its maximum size, well over a square kilometer, during the Hellenistic period, paralleling its political and territorial expansion. As Ken has outlined, early in the 1st century BC, Crete was conquered by the Romans and Knossos refounded as a colony with the settling of an unknown number of Campanian veterans. The loss of independent political status may be reflected in a marked reduction in size from the Hellenistic maximum. But despite its decline in political status, as Ken has just emphasized, at least by the 1st century AD, indications of prosperity are provided by the private architecture, including the exceptionally grand Villa Dionysus with its finely crafted mosaics, which Ken has already mentioned. The Roman mosaic tessera I mentioned earlier as a sad indication of the scale of destruction of the uppermost archaeological levels across the site provide a vivid example of the complementarity of excavation and survey evidence. So let me explain. Our one fragment of mosaic, here at the lower right, while I would like to think small but perfectly formed, and our bags of loose tessera are pretty difficult to get too excited about, and unfortunately cannot convey the standard of crafting in the mosaics for the Villa Dionysus, or inform us about the mythological illusions wealthy Cnossians invoked, okay? Precisely the kind of things that excavation can be superb at. But our work can help to contextualize these. On the left, against the distribution of all Roman pottery, are plotted in blue the excavated Roman mosaics. These have been interpreted as defining a limited but wealthy quarter along the main Roman northwest to southeast road through the center of the city. On the right, in red, are the loose mosaic tessera recovered by the survey, indicating in contrast the very extensive distribution of mosaics across the whole central third of the city. We're dealing with a wealthy city, and I think far more wealthy than we'd appreciated before. The locations of the known mosaics document the previously noted bias of research excavations near the prehistoric palace and rescue excavations under the villages and the main road, the main modern road. In contrast, this area is low in surface tessera, which seems a little anomalous. If we know they're mosaics, how come we're not getting the surface tessera? Well, we're not getting them because, one, much of it's built over, so we couldn't look there. It was inaccessible for survey. Or much of that area is, in fact, the original Evans estate, which has not been planted in olives. And so the subsurface deposits have not been disturbed to the same degree, bringing the material to the surface. And also, because it's not cultivated today, it's got denser variation, and we simply couldn't see all the little tessera there. So we've obviously got our own biases that we're building in from the surface evidence, but the more continuous picture of the archaeology of the area and our understanding of our biases allows us to contextualize and understand the biases of the excavated record more effectively to be able to use those different sources together. So therefore, we can use the survey to improve our understanding of the excavation record, not simply fill in the gaps in the previous spatial coverage. Now, the rampant consumerism and diverse material culture of the Roman phase holds out the most promise for developing an understanding of the nature and organization of the city, contrasting different types of material distributions, and I give you the major ones here. Perhaps surprisingly, given the intense archaeological exploration of Roman sites throughout the empire, this is one of the relatively few Roman cities that has been completely surveyed. Ringing the site, as in earlier periods, are extensive cemeteries, with most bedrock exposures in the south and southwest riddled with rock-cut chamber tombs. A broad range of tomb types, including simple tile and pit graves, but also built cists, vaulted tombs, and elaborate mausolea, document a diverse and socially complex mortuary landscape. The most ostentatious built mausolea appear to cluster along the high visibility north and south routes out of the valley. Traces of the Roman aqueduct and many quarries provide information on the wider landscape context of the city. As Ken has noted, the end of the city's life has been poorly documented by excavations within the city. A particular problem for the past 30 years has been reconciling the lack of excavated occupation deposits with the massive 5th to 7th century mortuary basilica excavated by the British School on the site of the Late Bronze Age through Roman North Cemetery. The nearby Sanitarium Basilica, as well as traces of Roman masonry at the surviving village church of Hagia Sophia and ruins of a Byzantine chapel at Agios Kyrillos, round out a picture of continuing religious life and death, but no corresponding community was documented. As Ken also noted, particularly from his own excavations, a few deposits and some stray material of 5th to 6th century date has been excavated, but the evidence is extremely patchy. I think we can now fill this gap by recognizing later Roman to early Byzantine surface material concentrated in the northwest quarter of the Roman city. This has previously been missed because of the focus of the excavations to the south, the fairly ephemeral nature of late antique constructions, and the destruction of the uppermost deposits in the plough soil. It is likely that the lower village, the Kritikos, survived as a hamlet through the post-Roman period around its Roman church, but there is no evidence for the survival of Knossos on an urban scale beyond the last burials about 700 AD or so. That coastal HERAKLEION, a port community from at least the Hellenistic period, probably developed continuously through the Roman and early Byzantine, and later the Saracen, late Byzantine, and Venetian to Ottoman periods. It seems likely that most of the population of Knossos gradually relocated during the later Roman and early Byzantine periods. For the long post-Roman period, the survey record essentially represents a low-density off-site scatter of material, probably introduced to the agricultural fields through manuring and domestic refuse. Throughout this period, in addition to serving the small populations of the hamlets of Makutikos and Fortezza, the valley was part of the agricultural hinterland of Candia, modern HERAKLEION. Now, what I've whizzed through rapidly and tried to present to you this afternoon is very much just a sketch based on first assessments. We have completed our initial look at all recovered materials, but specialist studies have really only just begun. But I hope this gives you an idea of what the project aims to do. It should be obvious just how much it builds on the previous century of excavations, but is also aimed to do something new, to provide a more comprehensive framework within which past research can be more fully contextualized, synthesized, and interpreted, working at the scale of the city as a whole, not just individual excavations. Throughout, I've tried to show how the two types of evidence are complementary, the rich detail provided by an excavation more effectively interpreted through understanding its wider context. Attention to the full sequence is particularly important because historical records for Crete are generally more limited than for many other areas of the Aegean. Taking comparable approaches to the entire archaeological record at Knossos also encourages diachronic comparisons and consideration of long-term patterns of development. Different sources contribute to our understanding of the sequence in the different periods, so comparative approaches are likely to be mutually informative as well as challenging. As we try to make sense of our new material, we constantly draw upon the tremendous resources available for the study of this key site. These owe much to the long, intensive, and productive research engagement at the site by the British School at Athens, now increasingly supplemented by rescue excavations. Through the exceptional importance of the site, this also provides a cross-section of the history of human occupation on the island, with much wider ramifications through its off-island connections and influence into the wider Aegean. We'd like to thank both of our host institutions and the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, for supporting the project, and the Ministry of Culture for granting the permit for the fieldwork to the British School. We'd also particularly like to thank the residents of the Knossos Valley, who almost universally allowed us to survey their properties, and the many volunteers who have participated in the project to date, a number of whom are here in the audience today. Thank you.